On August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina made landfall, devastating Gulf Coast communities in Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. 85% of these water systems in these areas were affected. More than 1,200 water systems and 200 wastewater systems suffered damage, and some were completely disabled. Some of the very smallest were not reached by emergency authorities for several days, and some turned out to be completely destroyed when they arrived. However, 35 to 40% of these systems were up and running in a couple of weeks. You already know the story of how Katrina devastated New Orleans. As it came ashore, the hurricane's sustained winds of 145 miles per hour and coastal storm surges of up to 25 feet of water pushed water from Lake Pontchartrain into the bowl in which New Orleans sits below sea level, topping levees and undermining levees, particularly in the poorest neighborhoods. The New Orleans water system has two plants, the largest of which serves 1.2 million people, and it was disabled due to the flooding. The smaller plant is across the river, and it remained operational. It also served as the command center and even for the executive director and her staff for several days after the storm. So in addition to getting an urgent request to find heavy equipment, the director also asked us to find commercial clothes washers and dryers. Every single every single vehicle in the utilities fleet was lost in the flood, including heavy trucks used for main replacement. The utility even had to replace the filtration sand because the Corps of Engineers in the form of large bags that were dropped into the levee breaches. Another effect of the disabled water system was the loss of water for firefighting. As gas lines ruptured, you saw pictures of that in Professor Meinhardt's presentation. Several buildings burned to the water line, and you can still see those today if you tour the city. Aside from a few local reporters, police officers, and bartenders, 500,000 residents had to abandon the city, even those whose neighborhoods didn't flood. And today the city's population stands at only about half of the original amount. And of course, this has had financial implications for the utility because they didn't have anyone to build for a long time. As the water receded, the water system began drying out its pumping facilities and electrical systems. The distribution system and disinfection treatment had to be made functional again. Miles and miles of water mains, many of which were 75 years old and being held together from water pressure alone, broke and leaked, more so than its usual amount. And a large percentage of the water authority's employees, including professional staff, had evacuated, and many never returned after having made new lives for themselves in other parts of the country. What Katrina showed was that emergency preparedness and response demanded that federal, state, and local governments and the private sector embrace a common set of standards for responding to disasters, whether terrorism, hurricanes, earthquakes, or other natural disasters. After 9/11 and prior to Katrina, the federal government began developing what came to be called the National Incident Management System, or NIMS. And I'm not an expert at NIMS, but I'll try to describe what it is. And to persuade state and local governments to adopt NIMS, Congress passed a law that required the adoption of the framework, or else not qualify for federal funding for emergency preparedness grants. It's a federal program developed at the federal level, but there was much input from all levels of government and the private sector, and it's also flexible enough that local jurisdictions can adapt to their own situations. And relevant to this conference, NIMS and other emergency response approaches has a role for the private sector and NGOs. It recognizes that the private sector, which includes utilities, public and private, as well as private companies, NGOs, and nonprofits, are a good source of best practices in many areas of preparedness, emergency management, and incident response. We have much to learn from the experiences of the Red Cross, the UN, and other organizations in their responses to natural disasters. The adoption of the NIMS framework means being able to operate under national standards, common standards, in several areas. For instance, preparation through standard operating procedures, training exercises, and contingency plans with public and private stakeholders. And providing much of the expertise here are experts from utilities, emergency response experts, and private consultants. Another aspect is credentialing licensing, and it's the credentialing of key staff who would be allowed into disaster sites to make repairs. This was a major problem in New Orleans shortly after the hurricane hit, where the private sector was not allowed into the disaster areas to repair telecommunications, power, and other utilities. It took days for the private sector to negotiate with the authorities to be let in. Is the acquisition of standardized response and telecommunications equipment so that similar technologies existed across various jurisdictions. And also the development of communications plans with public health authorities, the community through the media, and government partners. There's also the aspect of information management, and that involves scheduled status reports to incident commanders and the acquisition of report and locational data. There's also resource management, and this means the anticipation of supplies and transportation, among other resources. In the case of a water system, of course, that means the provision of water treatment chemicals and diesel for backup generators, among other things. And finally, the NIMS framework calls for the establishment of mutual aid agreements among members of the various industry sectors. In the case of the water sector, these are agreements within states among utilities. So in the water sector, this has manifested itself into the creation of water and wastewater assistance networks. And the concept is that the utilities comprise these networks and go to the rescue of other utilities with supplies, equipment, and trained personnel when disaster strikes. California and a handful of other states had developed these networks in the 1990s, including some consisting of as few as two utilities, such as I learned recently the relationship between Los Angeles and a utility in the Bay Area, prearranging the supply and support that may be needed after a disaster. Since Katrina, 32 sets of utilities and states have established these response networks. Very few existed when Katrina made landfall in 2005, but one that did was the Florida network of utilities, which helped restore operations at many along the Gulf Coast and conducted damage assessments at others. And another example of a utility helping another utility is the case of New Orleans and Portland, Oregon, which is a remarkable story. The two utilities did not have a pre-existing relationship for emergency response, but the concept is the same. In the weeks following the hurricane, the Portland Water Bureau deployed teams of 5 qualified personnel driving a convoy of utility trucks and other vehicles 2,700 miles from Portland down to New Orleans. And they spent weeks there living in tents and repairing water lines, repairing pumps that hadn't been serviced in many years, and repairing water meters and other parts of the system.